He found a man dying in the dust, no name, no boots, no reason to be trusted. But the rancher didn't ask questions. He just gave him bread, water, and fire. By dawn, 200 armed riders stood at his fence line. They didn't come to thank him. They came to punish him for feeding the one man they'd sworn to hunt. Now, the quiet act of mercy has become a line in the sand. And everyone's waiting to see who will bleed first. Would you risk everything just to do what's right? The sky boiled with dust, the kind that turned midday into dusk and coated your teeth in grit. From the porch of a lonely ranch house built with his own hands, the rancher saw them not just riders, but a wave of fury and iron. 200 strong, riding abreast, shoulder to shoulder like a single organism bred for war. No banners, no warning. Just hooves pounding like distant thunder across the high mesa, shaking the earth with every gallop. Before the dust settles on this quiet mercy, before the riders choose between blood and honor, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These aren't just stories of outlaws and ranchers. They're about choices made in silence, when no one's watching. Your support keeps the fire lit in places where justice rides slow and mercy rides alone. One click helps us stand a little longer at the edge of the storm, listen harder to the voice that says, "Feed him," and share the stories this land refuses to forget. Thank you. The horizon, once empty and patient, now surged with judgment. He didn't move. Boots planted on the wooden planks, rifle leaning by the door untouched, the rancher stood still as the storm came for him. His dog whined low and retreated under the floorboards, but the man stayed put. No fear in his stance, but no defiance either, only stillness, like someone who'd already counted the cost. The riders fanned out as they reached the edge of his land, kicking up a veil of dirt that dimmed the world. The air turned dry as gunpowder. Silence followed, not peace, but the kind of pause that comes before a breaking. From the dust, one man broke through. He rode a black horse with a scarred ear and carried no visible weapons, but power hung on him like a shadow. His coat bore the wear of 10 years in places men don't live long. A branded V seared into the leather. When he dismounted, the others stayed mounted, a sign. This wasn't a visit, it was a reckoning. He walked across the yard slow, each step measured, boots crunching gravel like the tick of a clock. The rancher didn't flinch, didn't offer a greeting. The man stopped 3 paces away, removed his gloves with a calm that felt more like mourning than rage. "You fed him," he said. The rancher's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The man turned slightly, just enough to let the wind catch the edge of his coat. Dust curled between them like smoke. "You fed him," he repeated, quieter now. "Did you even ask his name?" Still nothing. "I want you to look," the man said, gesturing behind him. The wall of riders shifted, and from their midst, they pulled something forward, not a man, not quite, a body. Bound, beaten, half alive. The rancher's eyes narrowed. It was the stranger. The one he'd given bread and fire to less than 2 days before. "He wasn't lost," the horseman said. "He was running, from us." The rancher finally spoke. His voice was dry, low. "He was starving." "And now you're marked," the man answered. "Same as him." Wind surged between them. A gust slammed the screen door behind the rancher, but he didn't turn. The sound of guns being cocked echoed across the plains like bones breaking in the dark. "You gonna hand him over?" the rider asked. The rancher didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence was an answer. His feet didn't move. His hand didn't reach for the rifle behind him. He simply stood there, wind tugging at his coat, eyes locked with the man who had brought 200 horsemen to his gate. The horseman stepped back. "Then you best pray the sun never sets." And with that, he turned to his men. "Circle the house." The wind carried no mercy that day. It scraped the land raw, lifting dry sand in swirls that stung the eyes and left no shade untouched by heat. The rancher rode alone, his saddle creaking under the weight of a day gone too long. Fence wire slung coiled at his hip, one hand resting on the horn, the other loosely holding the reins. He wasn't riding anywhere urgent, just checking the perimeter, where buzzards liked to circle and coyotes sometimes found weakness in the fence line. It was routine until it wasn't. He spotted the shape before he understood it. At first glance, it looked like a pile of torn clothes tossed near a dead mesquite tree, half buried in sun-baked dirt. But something in its stillness was wrong. Not the stillness of something discarded, but the kind that holds on by instinct. He reined in slow, the horse stamping twice in the dust, uneasy. The man on the ground was barely that anymore. His skin had gone the color of old parchment, blistered and red where sun had chewed through it. No shoes, no hat. Lips cracked wide open like dry land in drought. He wasn't shivering, he didn't have the strength left for that. One eye fluttered, then closed again. No words. Just the faintest whisper of breath. The rancher dismounted without a sound. No curse, no exclamation, no call for help, just silence as he knelt beside the man and checked his pulse, his neck, his eyes. A tremor, faint as a dying spark, answered back. That was enough. He didn't ask who he was or where he'd come from. Didn't look for a badge, a letter, or a wanted poster. In these parts, questions like that were invitations to trouble. He simply braced the man's shoulders, hefted him over the saddle like dead weight, and climbed up behind him. The horse shifted under the burden, but obeyed. By the time they returned to the ranch house, dusk had begun to smudge the edges of the sky. The horizon glowed, but not warm, just tired. The rancher laid the man out on a bed of old wool blankets near the hearth. The fire hadn't been lit yet, but it would be. He pumped the well, filled a basin, and began sponging the dirt and heat from the man's face. The bread came next, stale, but softened in water. He broke it in half, then into quarters, feeding it slowly to a man too weak to chew. Water followed in careful spoonfuls. At one point, the stranger's eyes opened, startled like an animal expecting pain. But all he saw was a calloused hand, offering a tin cup and nothing else. That night, the fire crackled low. Outside, coyotes sang to the moon like they always did. Inside, the rancher sat by the stove, boots off, hat hung on a peg. The stranger slept fitfully, breath rattling, the worst of the fever just beginning to break. Still no name, still no past. And yet, something changed in that silence. No badge, no judgment, just bread, water, and fire. The morning light came in slantwise through the cracked window panes, painting the wooden floor in gold and dust. It was quiet in the house, too quiet, except for the soft scrape of tin against wood as the stranger lifted spoon to mouth with the slow caution of someone who'd once been punished for eating too fast. He sat hunched at the edge of the kitchen table, shoulders taut beneath a borrowed shirt that hung too loose. His boots, an old pair the rancher had found out in the shed, rested uncertainly on the floor, like he hadn't yet decided whether to stay or bolt. The rancher sipped coffee from a chipped mug by the stove, not looking at the man but not avoiding him either. He moved like someone who understood silence not as absence, but as language. Every action he took, checking the stove, adding a log to the fire, adjusting the kettle, was measured, deliberate, designed to keep the peace. "You from east of the river?" he asked eventually, not looking up. The stranger didn't answer right away. He swallowed another spoonful of beans, then glanced toward the door, toward the windows, toward the side knife resting a foot away on the table. When he did speak, it was barely above a breath. "I go where I need to." The rancher nodded once, slow. "Name's Wills," he said. "Don't matter much if you say yours." The stranger set his spoon down and looked at the man across from him for the first time, not with gratitude, not even with suspicion. Just the cool, flat stare of someone trying to solve a problem without being seen solving it. "I owe you nothing," he said. no venom in it. Just fact. Wills didn't flinch, didn't ask for anything. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't dangerous either. It had the tension of two animals deciding whether to share water. The stranger stood slowly, joints cracking, and nodded once stiff, not unfriendly. Then he walked out the front door without another word. Wills didn't follow. He just watched him go through the window, watched the stranger cross the yard with slow purpose and disappear into the barn. Inside the barn, dust hung thick in shafts of late sun, catching on particles of hay and rust. The stranger moved with care. He found the old rifle tucked behind a broken saddle, under a pile of rotting canvas. It hadn't been fired in years, not since Will's brother died and the sound of bullets lost its romance. The man didn't check the chamber, he already knew it was empty. He didn't load it. He just sat in the hay with a rag and a tin of oil, cleaning it slow, methodical. Like he was polishing a memory, not a weapon. When he was done, he walked 50 paces behind the barn, where the ground was soft and the earth hadn't dried to stone. He dug with his hands. No shovel, no ceremony. Just grit and silence. When he finished, he buried the rifle deep. No one saw. No one asked. That night, Will sat alone on the porch, watching stars emerge one by one like truths from silence. Behind the house, the stranger lay still in the bunkhouse bed, one hand tucked under his pillow, the other resting on his chest. Sleep didn't come easy to men with ghosts, and Wills knew the look of a man trying to bury one. The first light of day bled pale over the ridgeline, and with it came shadows that didn't move like deer or cattle. Wills had risen early, as he always did, coffee percolating on the stove while the wind whispered dry through the cracks in the kitchen wall. He stepped outside with his mug, boots scuffing against the boards, and squinted toward the horizon. They were there. 3 figures, maybe 4. Still as fence posts, just under the crest of the ridge to the west. No horses in sight, but the way they stood broad-legged, patient, watching told him they hadn't come to visit. Wills didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't turn his head or shout. He just looked at them, long enough for them to know he saw, then turned back inside and shut the door without a sound. The stranger wasn't at the table anymore. His cot in the bunkhouse had been made before dawn, tucked with military precision. The fire pit was cold. Wherever he was, he'd gone silent, just like the watchers on the hill. By mid-morning, dust rose from the south like a fuse being lit. Hoofbeats, one rider this time, tearing up the trail like the devil was behind him. Wills knew the sound before he saw the horse. Only one man in the county rode that fast without panic. Sheriff Holt, 30 years in the saddle, and never drawn his sidearm in town. Today, though, he rode with his coat unbuttoned and his hand twitching near the grip. The sheriff didn't dismount. He just circled once, hard, and reined in tight near the corral. His horse foamed at the bit, nostrils flaring. Wills met him halfway with the same calm he always wore, the kind that didn't scare easy. But Holt wasn't here for pleasantries. "Tell me you didn't take in a man passed out by the fence line 2 days back," he said, breath short. "Tell me it ain't true." Wills didn't answer. The sheriff sighed and wiped dust from his brow. "Damn it, Wills, do you even know what kind of fire you've lit?" Still, no answer. Holt leaned closer, voice dropping. "Man named Eli Gant escaped custody south of the pass. Deserted a private militia unit, killed 2 of his own to do it. Was last seen heading north with nothing but the clothes on his back and a scar over his eye." He paused. "Your visitor, he got a scar?" Wills finally nodded, slow. The sheriff's face tightened. "If it's him, feeding him, giving him shelter even for a night, that's not just charity anymore. That's a line in the sand." The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of mesquite smoke from beyond the ridge. Controlled, deliberate, like a signal. Holt noticed it too, and turned his head slightly, eyes narrowing. "They're watching you," he said. "Watching to see which side you land on." You may've thought you were doing a good deed, but if it's Gant. Feeding him was a declaration of war. Wills looked past the sheriff, toward the ridge where the figures still stood, unmoving. I fed a man, he said, voice low. Holt shook his head. No, Wills. You fed a cause, and that cause is comin' for payment. The town hall hadn't seen a crowd this large since the last drought brought men to blows over water rights. Now it was packed to the rafters with clenched jaws, loud voices, and the smell of sweat and accusation. The air buzzed with that particular kind of fury that doesn't need facts, just fear, and a name to hang it on. Wills was shoved through the double doors by a pair of ranch hands who used to shake his hand after church. He didn't resist. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood there in the center of the room as if he'd walked in of his own accord. Dust streaked his coat, his collar was turned, but his eyes were steady. Around him, the heat swirled, louder than the July Sunday. Why'd you do it, Wills? Someone near the back shouted. He fed a fugitive, that's what he did. Barked another. He invited danger to our children. The mayor tried to bang the old iron gavel, but the sound was swallowed by rage. Men weren't waiting for answers. They were asking to accuse. Wills said nothing. He didn't flinch as men stood up one after another, listing every trespass they feared. That he'd sheltered a killer. That he'd betrayed the unwritten code of neighbor first, stranger never. That his land now marked theirs. Mrs. Callahan stood up, voice trembling, not with fear but history. My husband served under Eli Gant. He told me stories about the things that man did in the territories. You think you gave food to a man? You fed a ghost, Wills. A ghost that brings fire behind him. Maybe he didn't know who it was, someone offered half-heartedly, though even that was met with groans. The preacher stepped forward from the wall. He was old, slow, skin like burnt parchment, but his voice had not dimmed with time. He didn't stand on the platform. He stayed on the floor, at eye level with Wills. I want to ask a question, the preacher said, quieting the room by sheer will. And I want only one man to answer it. His gaze locked with Wills. Did he ask you for help? Wills took a moment. Then nodded. Did you give it freely? Another nod. Did you know who he was? Will's voice came at last, low and plain. Didn't matter. The room broke into overlapping shouts, but the preacher raised a hand, and somehow, it held them still. So then, he said, looking out over the crowd, I ask you all something else. Would you turn away a starving man to save your cattle? Would you close your door to mercy, just in case it cost you something? A hard silence followed. Not peaceful, simmering. Whatever you do for the least of these, the preacher added, voice heavy, you do also unto me. Someone cursed under their breath. A chair scraped. Don't quote scripture when it's your ranch that ain't circled by riders, snapped a rancher near the window. And yet the question hung in the room, unanswered but loud. Would you risk everything to keep one promise to a stranger? Because that's what it was, now a promise. A line drawn. A fire already lit, and the smoke from the ridge was still rising. For a long moment, no one noticed the boy. The grown men filled every corner of the town hall, breathing heavy with judgment, puffed up with pride and fear, arguing over right and wrong like they had a monopoly on both. The preacher had gone quiet again, folding his arms in the corner, eyes narrowed but silent. Wills stood in the middle of the storm, unchanged, still calm, still unbowed. The air was thick with heat, and something worse, certainty. Then a soft voice, barely a thread, cut through it all. I know him. Heads turned in ripples. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't loud, but it was clear enough, and real enough to matter. A boy stepped out from behind the benches. Couldn't have been older than 9. Sandy-haired, freckled, wearing boots 2 sizes too big, and clutching something small and knotted in his hands. No one stopped him, no one dared. He walked up slow, deliberate, until he stood beside Wills and looked out at the crowd like he was used to being overlooked and had chosen today to fix that. This was his, he said. He held up the cloth frayed and sun-bleached. Dirt smudged at the corners, stained a faded rust color in the center. Wills took one glance and knew it wasn't just a rag. He'd seen men die clutching less than that. The boy turned it over. Sewn into the corner, still faintly visible despite the years, was a symbol. A star-shaped brand surrounded by a circle of barbed wire. Not a military crest. Not a lawman's badge, something older, personal. It matched the carving on the stranger's belt. Whispers moved fast now, faster than fear. Several men took steps forward, squinting to see, trying to remember. "He gave it to me," the boy said. 3 years ago, down near Hollow Creek. My pa, he got thrown from a mule, broke his leg bad. There were coyotes circling, and I didn't know what to do. I was just a little thing." He hesitated, then looked up at the faces surrounding him, defiant. "The man you're talking about, he showed up out of nowhere. Scared the coyotes off, stopped the bleeding. Said not to thank him." "What's your daddy's name, son?" asked the preacher gently. "Sam Rayner," the boy said. "He's gone now. But he told me, if you ever see a man with that mark, you owe him the same thing he gave us." And just like that, the shape of the room changed. Not everyone shifted, not all minds moved, but something broke, something solid and self-righteous cracked just enough to let light through. The certainty that had held like iron began to bend. A rancher in the back removed his hat. A woman near the aisle muttered a prayer. And one man who'd been shouting loudest earlier now looked down at his boots, ashamed. Because now, the stranger wasn't just a name, or a rumor, or a threat drawn in shadows. He had a past here, a witness. And someone owed him. Wills looked down at the boy, then out at the crowd. No smile, no triumph. Just a flicker of something deeper, truth that didn't need to be shouted. And the cloth, small and quiet in the child's hands, said more than any rifle ever could. The first sound was low, so low it felt like a pulse beneath the earth. A steady rhythm, barely noticeable at first, like distant thunder muffled behind stone. Then the windows began to tremble in their frames, their old glass humming with tension, and the dust on the shelves danced in small, uncertain patterns. Inside the house, the ranch dog growled, not at any one thing, but at the weight in the air. Something massive was moving, something many-limbed and alive. Wills rose from his chair and stepped outside. He didn't have to ask. The horizon, just past the low ridge where the dry grass met the pale sky, boiled with dust and motion. Horses, more than he could count in one glance, poured down like a flood held back too long. Riders rode in waves, dark silhouettes outlined by sun glare, some masked, some barefaced, all moving with a unity that spoke of shared blood, shared loss, and a hunger for reckoning. They weren't wild, they weren't loud. There were no shouts, no rebel cries, only silence and precision. The way soldiers move when they've buried too many friends to be careless. The townsfolk had begun to gather. Doors opened in silence. Men stood on porches. Mothers pulled children behind skirts and shuttered windows. The preacher held his Bible against his chest but didn't open it. No one prayed out loud. At the edge of the yard, Wills stood alone, waiting. And then, from the bunkhouse, the stranger emerged. He no longer looked like a man running from death. He wore a fresh shirt, shoulders squared, his stride sure and slow. His face, still drawn from hunger, now bore a kind of solemn gravity like a man preparing to speak over a grave. His belt was strapped again, the carved sigil now cleaned and visible. The sun caught it as he walked past Wills and into the open, between the rancher and the approaching storm. The riders reined in at a distance close enough for gunfire, far enough for conversation. 200, maybe more. Their leader rode forward, same scarred coat, same black horse, with one ear curled from old injury. His hand rested on the pommel, but he didn't draw. The stranger raised his voice, not shouting, just enough for it to carry across the wind. "He fed me," he said. The words landed like iron. No justification. No plea, just a statement. Simple and impossible to ignore. "He fed me," the stranger repeated, slower now. Not because he knew who I was, not because he wanted anything in return. He did it because I was starving. A murmur passed through the riders. Heads turned, hands loosened on reins. Something invisible shifted, the way weather does before a storm decides whether to strike or move on. "I know what you rode here for," the stranger said, eyes on the man who led them. "You came for vengeance, for the deserter, for the ghost you thought I was." He stepped aside slightly, revealing Wills behind him. But he didn't feed a traitor, he fed a man. Silence fell heavier than before. Even the wind held its breath. The lead rider sat still, jaw tight, mind racing behind unreadable eyes. Then he dismounted, slowly, deliberately. Dirt crunched under his boots as he walked forward, stopping just short of the line where the wild met the rancher's fence. He looked from the stranger to Wills. And for the first time, he spoke. "Then we owe him more than bullets." The sun stood still overhead, heavy and white, casting sharp shadows that painted the yard like a trap. The riders had encircled the homestead, their horses forming a tight ring that spanned the fence line, the barn, the fields beyond. Every movement was deliberate, every silence laced with memory. It wasn't a siege, it was something older, something ritualistic, a reckoning. Wills stood just inside the edge of the porch, boots firm on the boards, arms slack at his sides. He hadn't moved since the stranger stepped forward. His face was calm, but his eyes watched everything: the dust curling around hooves, the tightening grips on saddles, the way old grudges wore new faces. The stranger stood at the center of it all, wind stirring the hem of his coat. He no longer looked like a fugitive. He looked like a witness returned from the grave, a messenger from a past none of them had dared revisit. From inside his coat, he drew a bundle wrapped in waxed leather and bound with a faded red cord. Time had weathered the edges, but it had not broken the seal. He held it up. Some of the older riders saw it first, and their expressions shifted: not fear, but recognition. A few exchanged glances. One crossed himself. The stranger untied the cord with careful fingers, then unfolded the document for all to see. No grand gesture, no theatrics, just gravity. It was a contract, yellowed and creased but intact. The ink had bled at the corners, but the symbols were clear. Names, ranks, blood marks. The seal of a unit formed in the shadow of war. Men who had sworn loyalty not to a flag, but to each other, to survival, to honor, to the ones who never came back. The lead rider stepped closer, eyes locked on the document. He reached forward slowly, almost reverently, and touched the edge with 2 fingers. "I thought this burned in Fort Amos," he said. "It did," the stranger replied. "But I carried this copy. My oath didn't end in ash." A pause followed, long and heavy. Then, one by one, the riders began to dismount. Not all at once, not fast, but like dominoes, tipping under the weight of memory. Boots hit dirt. Hands came off reins, hats were removed. They weren't bandits, not today. They were witnesses to something they thought they'd buried with their dead. Wills watched it unfold with quiet awe. The man he had fed with stale bread and silence was now commanding the attention of 200 hardened men with nothing but a paper and a past. There were no guns drawn, no shouted orders, just stillness and the raw force of remembered oaths. The lead rider turned toward the others, then toward Wills. His voice, when it came, was solemn. "This homestead stands under old protection now," he said. "And the man who fed our brother did more than he knew. The circle of fire had not burned, it had sanctified. And what had begun as an act of mercy had become something far greater. A reminder that the code still lived, if only barely, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to believe in it again. The dust didn't leave all at once. It hung low over the valley like a breath held too long, drifting through the broken slats of the barn, settling into the creases of old saddles and sun-cracked boots. But in time, the wind changed. And with it, the silence softened from one of danger to one of labor. Hoofprints filled with shadow, smoke faded to scent. Guns were holstered for good. A few riders stayed behind. Not because they had been asked, and not because of debt. They stayed because something in them stirred when the old seal was raised. When a tattered piece of paper called forth a version of themselves they thought long dead. They rolled up their sleeves, tethered their horses, and asked where the fence line needed mending first. The rancher gave no speeches. He didn't direct. He didn't object. He simply handed tools where needed and set the first post himself. They worked side by side, war-forged men now quiet with purpose. The land, scarred by fire and boots and fear, accepted their effort the way all land does, with silence and patience. The stranger said little. By the second day, he'd sharpened every blade in the shed. By the third, he'd fixed the broken hinge on the bunkhouse door. On the fourth, before the sun crested the ridge, he saddled his horse, filled a canteen, and cinched a rifle to the side of the saddle that had once carried his guilt. He didn't tell anyone he was leaving. But Wills was already waiting at the gate. They stood facing one another in that early light, dust curling around their boots, shadows long across the yard. No handshake, no farewell. Just the weight of understanding between two men who had passed through a fire neither had lit, but both had endured. The stranger mounted. He paused once, looking back toward the ranch house, the porch where he'd once eaten in silence, the stove where water had boiled, the fence line where watchers once stood. Then he turned his gaze north, toward hills that waited without promise or threat, just space. He said one thing: keep feeding the right ones. And then he rode. No gallop. Just a steady, unhurried pace that respected the trail ahead. He didn't look back again. Wills watched him until he became part of the hills, no more distinct than the rocks or wind-blown trees. Only then did he turn back to the homestead, to the sound of nails being driven, the bark of a dog now unafraid, and the quiet hum of a place still standing. The voice of the narrator enters like wind over dry grass. In the West, justice travels slow, but mercy moves faster. It rides alone, stops when it doesn't have to, and leaves behind something no badge can enforce. The law may ask who a man island, but his mercy? That tells you what kind of man he chooses to be. What would you have done? Next time, the man you help might not be who he claims, or might be more.